The studio lights were bright, and the stage crew moved around quickly as they prepared for one of the most anticipated interviews of the week. The audience outside was already buzzing with excitement, eager to watch a face-to-face meeting between one of America's most famous talk show hosts and one of Hollywood's most beloved actors. People had lined up outside the building hours earlier, holding signs and posters, some hoping for just a glimpse of the actor they had admired for years. This was not just any guest. This was Keanu Reeves. Keanu had become a rare figure in Hollywood. Unlike many others in the film industry, he carried with him an air of humility and calmness. People spoke about his kindness in everyday encounters, whether it was offering his seat on the subway to a stranger, quietly donating to causes without expecting recognition, or simply greeting fans with a smile and patience. He was known for his big action roles on the screen, but off-screen, his soft-spoken nature and genuine personality set him apart. For many fans, this interview with Stephen Colbert promised to show more of that side of him. Inside the studio, Stephen Colbert was also preparing. Known for his sharp wit and ability to draw humor from almost any situation, he was a master of creating television moments. Producers had set up the show carefully, ensuring there would be plenty of laughs and light-hearted questions. Yet behind the curtain, away from the cameras and microphones, there was a quiet moment that no one outside the studio expected. Keanu had arrived early, dressed simply as always. His dark jacket and calm smile made him look approachable, even though he was a global star. He walked with quiet steps, nodding politely to the crew and shaking hands with those who greeted him. When Stephen finally approached to welcome him before the show, the two exchanged friendly words. But soon, the conversation took a turn that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Stephen, in his usual direct way, made a request that seemed unusual for a celebrity interview. He asked Keanu if, during the show, he could avoid speaking about his personal faith or any spiritual beliefs he might hold. He explained it quickly, as if it was a small matter, but the weight of the words hung heavily in the air. For a moment, Keanu said nothing. He simply looked at Stephen, his calm eyes showing more thought than reaction. For years, Keanu had rarely spoken openly about faith in interviews. He was never someone who tried to force his views on others, nor did he make his beliefs a central topic of conversation. Instead, he kept those things private, letting his actions and gentle personality reflect his values. Yet, he also never pretended to hide that part of himself. To him, it was simply part of who he was, woven naturally into his outlook on life and the kindness he showed others. The request to keep silent about it was not just about avoiding a topic, it felt like being asked to deny an important piece of his identity. And while Keanu was known for being agreeable and easygoing, he was also known for having quiet strength. He believed in honesty, even in the simplest forms. To act otherwise, especially on a stage where millions would be watching, was not something he could accept easily. The backstage room felt suddenly still. A few of the producers shifted uncomfortably, realizing that what was meant to be a small suggestion had turned into a moment of tension. Keanu, however, did not raise his voice or argue. Instead, he took a slow breath and replied with the same calm tone that had always defined him. He explained that he respected the show, he respected Stephen, and he respected the audience. But he could not agree to hide who he was. His faith, he said, was not a performance. It was not something he brought out only when convenient. It was simply a quiet part of him, one that guided his kindness and his choices. Stephen listened, perhaps surprised by the firmness hidden beneath Keanu's gentle words. The actor's response was not angry, but it was clear. There was no space for pretending or editing himself for the sake of the show. The moment was delicate, because both men were respected public figures, and both understood the power of media. Yet, in that small exchange, it became clear that the interview might not go as planned. Meanwhile, outside the studio, the audience continued to chatter excitedly, unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. Some were holding up copies of movie posters, others whispered about favorite film moments, and many simply wanted to hear Keanu's thoughtful answers in his own unique style. They had no idea that, at that very moment, their beloved star was being asked to set aside a part of himself for the sake of an easy conversation. Inside, Keanu stood tall, his presence calm but unshakable. He was not a man of dramatic gestures or loud words, yet his quiet refusal carried more weight than if he had raised his voice. The crew members exchanged glances, sensing that something important was unfolding. The usually smooth preparation for an interview had suddenly become uncertain. The decision now rested on whether Keanu would compromise for the sake of television or hold on to his honesty. This was the beginning of a moment that would soon become a story on its own. What had started as just another late-night interview had turned into a test of character. Keanu's fans had always admired him for being different, not because of fame, not because of money, but because he seemed to live by a code of kindness and sincerity. And now, in this unexpected situation, he was showing those very qualities again, not through grand speeches, but through simple truth. The lights above the stage continued to shine, the cameras remained ready, and the laughter of the audience floated faintly from beyond the curtain. Yet in that quiet backstage space, everything had changed. Keanu had made it clear, he would not hide his faith, he would not pretend to be someone else, and he would not let a moment of entertainment come at the cost of his integrity. For the people waiting outside, the show was still about to begin. For Keanu and Steven, however, it had already begun with a conversation that would soon ripple far beyond that studio. The interview was no longer just about movies or light humor. It had become about something deeper, the courage to remain true to oneself, even when the world expects otherwise. The studio was alive with energy as the crew counted down to showtime. The audience filled the seats, their laughter and clapping echoing through the room as the warm-up comedian entertained them. Everyone was waiting for the moment when Stephen Colbert would walk out and bring on his famous guest. To the fans sitting there, this was nothing unusual, just another night of late-night television, another interview with another celebrity. But behind the curtain, something unusual was already unfolding, something no one in the audience had the faintest idea about. Keanu Reeves sat quietly in the green room, a small space designed to make guests comfortable before stepping into the spotlight. The room was filled with soft lights and snacks, and a monitor on the wall played the live feed of the audience cheering. His calm expression gave no hint of the tension that had just passed between him and Steven. Though the request had been made politely, the meaning behind it still hung in the air. Steven's words were still fresh in Keanu's mind: if you could just avoid bringing up anything about faith during the interview, it would make things smoother. It wasn't shouted or forced, it was delivered casually, almost as if it were a small request. But to Keanu, the request felt heavier than that. He wasn't a man who pushed his views on others, and in fact, he rarely spoke about personal beliefs at all. But the idea of hiding them, of pretending they didn't exist, was another matter altogether. Keanu leaned back in the chair, his hands resting gently on his knees. He had faced many challenges in life: loss, struggle, and the constant spotlight of fame, but what he faced now was different. This was not about a movie script or a role he played on screen. This was about his own truth, his quiet understanding of life, and the values that guided him. To step onto that stage and speak as though those values didn't exist would feel wrong. For Steven, however, the matter was more practical. He was used to guiding conversations, keeping them light and entertaining, and steering clear of anything that might divide his audience. The show was designed to make people laugh and relax at the end of a long day, not to stir debates or touch on sensitive matters. From his perspective, asking Keanu to avoid speaking about faith was simply about keeping the show's tone. But what seemed practical to him felt like a test of honesty to Keanu. A knock came at the door, and a producer peeked in. "5 minutes until we're live," she said with a smile, trying to keep the mood light. Keanu nodded politely, his calm demeanor unchanged. He thanked her softly, and as the door closed again, he stood up slowly. His tall frame seemed even steadier in that moment. He was a man who had been through storms in his personal life, yet his strength was never shown through loudness. It was always in his quiet refusal to bend when it came to the things that mattered. He walked down the hallway toward the stage entrance. Crew members rushed by with headsets and clipboards, adjusting lights and checking equipment. The energy of live television filled the air, yet Keanu seemed to carry his own calm atmosphere with him. His footsteps were unhurried, his presence almost grounding in contrast to the nervous energy around him. Steven was already waiting near the curtain, smiling at the audience as the cameras focused on him. He was in his element, cracking jokes and building excitement. The crowd roared with laughter, clapped loudly, and hung on every word. They were ready for the star guest to walk out. Yet behind his smile, Steven carried the knowledge of the conversation that had just happened. He knew Keanu had not agreed to his request, and the uncertainty of how the interview would unfold lingered in his thoughts. Finally, the cue came. The band played its upbeat notes, and Steven announced Keanu's name with enthusiasm. The audience erupted in cheers, their applause thunderous. As Keanu stepped out from behind the curtain, the noise grew even louder. People stood to their feet, clapping and cheering for the actor they had admired for years. He smiled warmly, raising a hand in greeting, his simple wave sending the crowd into another round of applause. Keanu took his seat, and Steven greeted him with his trademark humor. The opening questions were light, about movies, stunts, and funny behind-the-scenes stories. The audience laughed and enjoyed every moment, and for a short while, everything felt as expected. Yet, underneath the laughter, there was an unspoken tension. Keanu knew what had been asked of him, and Steven knew Keanu had not promised to comply. At any moment, the conversation could take a turn. As the questions continued, Steven leaned closer, guiding the conversation with his practiced skill. He joked, he teased, and he tried to keep the energy flowing smoothly. Keanu answered politely, his smile never fading, but there was a depth in his words that hinted at something more. He spoke about the meaning behind some of his roles, about the lessons he had learned from the characters he played, and about the importance of finding peace in a busy world. He never said the word directly, but the values behind his words were clear. The audience loved it. They laughed when he was funny, nodded when he was thoughtful, and clapped often. To them, it was simply Keanu being Keanu, kind, wise, and genuine. But for Steven, each thoughtful answer edged closer to the subject he had hoped to avoid. It was not confrontational, but it was honest, and that honesty shone through every sentence. As the conversation deepened, Steven faced a choice. He could either steer the discussion firmly back into humor or let it flow naturally, even if it touched on things he had asked to avoid. For the first time in a long while, he found himself struggling to control the direction of the interview. Keanu's calm presence had a way of changing the air in the room. It was not forceful, but it was powerful. The cameras captured every smile, every pause, every thoughtful glance. Millions of viewers at home would later watch this, unaware of the backstage request that had started it all. But in that studio, everyone present felt the subtle difference. This was not a typical interview. This was a moment where values quietly stood their ground against convenience. The tension was invisible to most, hidden beneath laughter and applause, but for those close to the stage, it was impossible to ignore. Producers exchanged quick glances. Crew members shifted in their places. And Steven himself, though still smiling, was beginning to realize that this was not going to be the easy conversation he had imagined. For Keanu, however, the path was simple. He was not there to argue or prove a point. He was simply being himself. And that, in the end, was all he had ever promised to be. The interview continued with the bright lights shining down, the cameras focused closely, and the audience laughing and clapping at the right moments. On the surface, everything looked like an ordinary late-night show. Steven kept his familiar rhythm, throwing in jokes, keeping the audience entertained, and guiding the questions smoothly. Keanu responded with his usual kindness, smiling, pausing to think before answering, and often surprising people with how thoughtful his words could be. But beneath all the laughter and applause, a quiet struggle was taking place. Keanu knew what had been asked of him before the cameras rolled. The request to hide his faith or avoid speaking about it still echoed in his mind. It was not something he could simply forget. To him, speaking honestly even in the simplest way was important. He wasn't a person who liked conflict, nor did he enjoy being the center of unnecessary attention. But honesty mattered to him. It mattered in the way he treated strangers, in the way he chose his roles, and in the way he lived his life. Steven, on the other hand, was starting to feel a tension he could not ignore. He had expected Keanu to simply glide through the interview with light-hearted answers, as most guests did. But Keanu's responses, though polite and soft, carried meaning. He spoke about finding peace in difficult times, about how life teaches lessons through pain, and about the importance of kindness. Though he never directly used words Steven feared might spark controversy, the essence of faith was clear in his tone. The way he spoke about life was not empty, it was grounded in something deeper. The audience, however, didn't sense any conflict. They were fully caught up in Keanu's charm. They laughed at his gentle humor, they clapped at his stories, and many sat quietly when he shared something more thoughtful. To them, this was not a clash of ideas. This was simply Keanu Reeves being his genuine self. And that was what they had come to see. Backstage, the producers whispered quietly among themselves. Some wondered if the conversation was drifting too far from the playful mood they usually wanted. Others, however, couldn't help but notice the way the audience was reacting. They weren't bored, and they weren't uncomfortable. In fact, they were more engaged than usual. Keanu's calm presence seemed to draw people in, making them listen closely. It was not the kind of loud entertainment that usually filled the show, but it had a power of its own. As the minutes went by, Steven leaned forward, trying to regain control of the conversation. He asked about movie stunts, about funny behind-the-scenes accidents, about celebrity friendships. Keanu answered them all, with gentle laughter and humility. But somehow, his answers always carried a little more than just a simple story. He spoke about teamwork, about trust, about gratitude, about lessons learned from every mistake. His words were not the dramatic statements of someone trying to make a point, they were simply the truth as he saw it. And this was where the struggle became clear. Keanu was not breaking the request directly, yet he was not obeying it either. He was simply being himself, allowing his values and beliefs to naturally show in what he said. It wasn't forced, it was effortless, and that was what made it even more powerful. Steven could feel it. For the first time that night, his usual control over the rhythm of the interview was slipping. He was used to guiding his guests, pulling laughs out of them, and keeping the audience on the exact track he wanted. But Keanu wasn't a guest who could be shaped that way. Not because he resisted, but because he simply didn't play along with pretense. His calm truthfulness shaped the conversation in a way that no amount of humor could fully cover. At one point, Steven asked about how Keanu dealt with loss, referring to some of the tragedies the actor had faced in his life. It was meant to be a serious question, but one that could quickly turn into a heartfelt yet safe conversation. The audience quieted, waiting for Keanu's reply. He lowered his gaze for a moment, thoughtful, and then spoke in his gentle tone. He said that pain had been a teacher to him, that through suffering he had learned to be compassionate toward others. He said that life was never about avoiding sadness, but about finding strength within it and sharing that strength with people who also struggled. The room grew still as he spoke. His words were not dramatic, but they carried weight. The audience listened in silence, and some even nodded softly as though they understood exactly what he meant. And in those words, though he never mentioned his faith openly, it was present. It was clear in the way he spoke of compassion, in the way he described strength, and in the way he valued life beyond fame or success. Stephen smiled, but it was a careful smile. He could sense that this was the very territory he had asked Keanu to avoid. Yet, it was happening without force, without confrontation. Keanu was not preaching, and he was not trying to change the subject deliberately. He was simply answering honestly. And in doing so, he was quietly breaking the barrier that had been set for him. For Keanu, this was not an act of rebellion. It was not about making a statement or winning an argument. It was simply about being true to himself. He believed that honesty was the least one could offer in a world full of noise and pressure. And if being honest meant letting his faith show naturally, then so be it. To him, there was no other way. The crew members continued their work, adjusting cameras and lights, but even they felt the shift in the air. Something about the interview didn't feel like the usual scripted routine. It felt more real, more unpolished, and strangely more powerful. The laughter that followed Keanu's lighter stories sounded genuine, but so did the quiet moments that came after his deeper words. Stephen tried again to lighten the mood, cracking jokes and keeping the audience laughing. And Keanu laughed along, always respectful, always kind. But no matter how many jokes were made, the memory of Keanu's deeper words lingered in the air. The audience wasn't going to forget them. They had seen something rare, a celebrity refusing to wear a mask, refusing to hide behind pretense, even when asked to. As the segment continued, Stephen realized something he hadn't expected. He could not stop Keanu from being who he was. No polite request, no clever redirection, no rehearsed question could make him pretend. And yet, Keanu wasn't being difficult. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't stubborn in the loud way most people understood. He was simply unshakable in his quiet honesty. The cameras captured it all: the laughter, the thoughtful silences, the warmth in Keanu's smile, and the firmness in his answers. For the audience at home, it looked like a fascinating interview, perhaps one of the most engaging ones they had seen. For those in the studio, however, it was clear that something much bigger was happening. This was no longer just a conversation between a talk show host and a movie star. It had become a moment where values and beliefs stood quietly but firmly against pressure. Keanu was showing, without ever raising his voice, that some things in life were not meant to be hidden or denied. And in that struggle, one thing became clear: Keanu Reeves would not compromise who he was, not for fame, not for television, not even for one of the biggest talk shows in the world. The minutes ticked by, and though the audience remained entertained, the tension behind the scenes grew heavier with every passing question. Stephen Colbert was an experienced host, someone who had guided hundreds of interviews with some of the biggest names in the world. He had handled moments of awkwardness, deflected uncomfortable questions, and always kept control of his stage. But this time, things felt different. Keanu Reeves sat calmly, his presence unshaken. He answered questions with warmth and a smile, but there was a depth in his words that could not be avoided. He was not loud, he was not confrontational, but his quiet honesty carried a strength stronger than any argument. Each time Stephen tried to shift the tone back to something light, Keanu's answers would slowly circle back to something more real, something that revealed who he truly was. It wasn't that Keanu was deliberately trying to make things difficult. He was not the kind of person who played games or tried to outshine anyone. He was simply being himself. And being himself meant speaking with sincerity, even when asked to avoid certain parts of his truth. That was the essence of his character. The audience clapped and laughed, not noticing the invisible struggle taking place. To them, it was just an entertaining interview filled with humor and thoughtfulness. But for Stephen and the producers, the tension was impossible to ignore. Before the show began, Keanu had been asked to avoid speaking about faith. Yet, here he was, letting it quietly shine through his words without ever naming it directly. At one point, Stephen leaned forward and asked, "What keeps you grounded when the world expects so much from you?" It was meant to be a safe question, one that could be answered with humor or a general comment about staying humble. But Keanu paused, his eyes lowering for a moment as if he was choosing his words carefully. When he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. He said that what kept him grounded was remembering that life was not about fame or wealth, but about how one treated others. He explained that respect, kindness, and humility mattered more than success. He added that he tried every day to live in a way that honored those values, even when the world was busy and full of noise. The audience went quiet for a few seconds before breaking into applause. They could feel the truth in his words. But to Stephen, this was the exact moment he had feared. Keanu had not said anything controversial, yet the meaning was clear. His beliefs, his sense of faith, were guiding every word. And he was not hiding it. Stephen tried to move on quickly, joking about Keanu's action roles and the number of times his characters had been knocked down on screen. The audience laughed again, and the mood lightened, but the earlier words still hung in the air. Keanu had made his point without trying to. He had shown that he would not pretend to be someone else, not even for the sake of a smooth interview. Backstage, the producers whispered urgently to each other. Some suggested cutting the segment early. Others thought it was best to let it continue. After all, the audience seemed to love it, and the ratings would surely benefit from such an authentic moment. But the request that had been made before the show, that unspoken agreement, was clearly being broken. The turning point came when Stephen asked another question, one that was supposed to bring laughter but instead opened the door to honesty. He asked, "What gives you hope when the world feels heavy?" The audience leaned in, expecting a light-hearted or funny answer. But Keanu, true to himself, answered with a calm smile. He said that hope comes from believing that people can still be kind, that love still exists even in the darkest places, and that life, no matter how hard, still holds beauty worth cherishing. The words were simple, but they carried power. They revealed the very faith Stephen had asked him to hide. Keanu wasn't preaching, and he wasn't trying to change anyone's mind. He was simply sharing what was real for him. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone in the room that he could not, and would not, pretend otherwise. Stephen shifted in his seat, his usual confident smile flickering for a moment. He tried to joke again, but the audience didn't laugh as loudly this time. They were still thinking about Keanu's words. And that was when it became clear, the interview could not continue as planned. The producers signaled from the sidelines, their faces tense. Stephen glanced toward them, then back at Keanu, who remained calm and composed. The audience clapped again, unaware of the quiet storm happening behind the curtain. For them, this was still a wonderful interview. But for the host and his team, it was reaching a breaking point. Keanu looked at Stephen kindly, almost as if he understood the struggle the host was facing. There was no anger in his expression, no challenge in his voice. He simply sat there, peaceful, steady, unshakable. It was as if he was saying without words, "This is who I am. I cannot be someone else, not even for this stage." The silence that followed grew heavier. Stephen forced a smile and thanked Keanu for his thoughtful answers. He tried to move into the next segment, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer the light entertainment he had planned. It had become something far more real, something that could not be undone. Finally, Stephen leaned back in his chair and gave a small nod, as if signaling to the crew. The cameras pulled back, the music played, and the segment ended earlier than expected. The audience cheered, thinking it was part of the normal flow of the show. But those behind the stage knew the truth. The interview had reached a point where it could no longer continue. Keanu stood and shook Stephen's hand politely. His smile was warm, and his posture calm, as though nothing unusual had happened. He thanked the crew, waved to the audience, and walked off the stage with the same quiet dignity he had carried from the start. The crowd continued to clap, some even shouting his name, thrilled by the chance to see him in person. They had no idea that behind the smooth ending, there had been a quiet battle of principles. To them, it was just another moment of Keanu's charm. But for those who knew, it was something far greater. What had started as a simple interview had become a turning point. Keanu had been asked to hide a part of himself, and he had refused, not with anger, not with defiance, but with honesty. He had shown that integrity does not require shouting or confrontation. Sometimes, it is strongest when expressed through calm, unwavering truth. As he left the studio, walking past crew members and producers, there was a sense of respect in the air. Even those who had worried about the show's direction could not help but admire his quiet strength. He had stood firm without raising his voice, without pointing fingers, and without making demands. He had simply been himself. The air outside the studio was cool and still, a contrast to the bright lights and noise that had filled the room just moments before. Keanu walked quietly past the security doors, his steps unhurried, his posture calm. The night was ordinary to anyone passing by, but inside that building, something unusual had just happened. An interview that had been expected to be light-hearted entertainment had ended in an unexpected silence, not because of anger or argument, but because of honesty. The audience leaving the studio laughed and chatted, thrilled that they had seen Keanu Reeves in person. They spoke about how kind and genuine he seemed, how his words had stayed with them, and how even his pauses felt thoughtful. None of them knew that backstage, there had been tension. None of them knew that the interview had ended earlier than planned. To them, it was a special night, one they would remember proudly. But behind the scenes, the mood was very different. Steven sat at his desk after the cameras stopped, his smile fading slowly. He was a professional, skilled at keeping the show moving, but he couldn't hide the weight in his thoughts. He had asked Keanu to avoid speaking about something important to him, and Keanu had quietly refused, not by breaking rules loudly, but by being himself. It was a reminder that not every guest could be shaped or steered, not every person could be asked to wear a mask. The producers gathered, their voices hushed but serious. Some were frustrated, worried about how the segment would be received. Others, however, felt a sense of admiration. They knew what had happened on stage was different from the usual routine. It had been more real, more human. And though it had not followed the plan, there was something powerful in that authenticity. Meanwhile, Keanu stepped into a waiting car, his expression peaceful. To him, the night was not about victory or conflict. It was about remaining true to himself. He had not gone on the show to argue, nor to make headlines. He had gone simply to share his thoughts and to connect with an audience. And in doing so, he had been asked to leave a part of himself behind. But he chose not to. Not because he wanted to rebel, but because honesty was a part of who he was. News of the interview spread quickly, as it always did when something unexpected happened on television. Fans who had been in the audience shared their impressions online. Some wrote about how genuine Keanu seemed, how his words about kindness and humility stayed with them even after the show ended. Others noticed how the segment had ended earlier than usual, and rumors began to form. Within hours, social media was filled with clips and comments. Many praised Keanu, saying that he had once again shown why people admired him, not just for his movies, but for his character. They said he was different from others in Hollywood, not because of fame, but because he never seemed to let it change him. He was still humble, still kind, still real. And in this moment, he had proved that again. For Steven and his team, the reactions were mixed. Some critics wondered why the interview had been cut short, while others praised the authenticity of the exchange. But regardless of opinions, one fact was clear: Keanu Reeves had not bent under pressure. He had not hidden who he was. Days passed, and the story continued to be shared. Articles were written, videos replayed, and discussions grew. Fans around the world admired how Keanu handled the situation with such grace. They compared him to others who often spoke loudly about their beliefs or argued forcefully on stage. Keanu had done none of that. He had remained calm, kind, and unshaken. And yet, his quiet refusal had carried more power than any loud declaration could have. It became clear to many that what made Keanu different was not just his talent, but his integrity. He was not someone who sought attention. He did not chase headlines. But when faced with a choice between pretending and being true, he always chose truth, no matter the cost. For Keanu, life was never about fame. He had seen too much of the world, too much pain and loss, to believe that fame or wealth were the real treasures of life. What mattered to him was kindness, compassion, and living with honesty. And that night on Stephen Colbert's stage, he had shown that once again. In the weeks that followed, the moment became a story people told each other. Fans spoke about it as proof of his character. Young people admired him not only as an actor but as a role model for staying true to oneself. Even those who had never been fans before found themselves respecting him after hearing the story. It was not about faith alone. It was about integrity, about refusing to let the world shape you into something you are not. Stephen himself, though unsettled at first, eventually reflected on the night with a different perspective. He had wanted control of the stage, as any host would. But what he had received instead was a lesson, one that reminded him of the power of authenticity. Even though it had been difficult in the moment, he could not deny the respect that grew for Keanu after seeing how calmly and firmly he held to his truth. Keanu moved on with his life as he always did, quietly, without seeking to relieve the moment. He continued filming movies, greeting fans with kindness, and living simply. For him, the night was just another reminder that staying true to himself was the only way he knew how to live. He had not planned to make a statement, but the world had heard one anyway. And that was the beauty of it. Keanu did not need to raise his voice to be heard. He did not need to argue to prove his point. His strength lay in his calmness, his humility, and his refusal to compromise on the values that mattered most. That was why people respected him. That was why the story of that interview lived on long after the cameras stopped rolling. In the end, it wasn't about Stephen, the producers, or even the show itself. It was about a man who chose to stand quietly in his truth, no matter the setting. And that choice, though simple, made all the difference. Fans who talked about the moment often said the same thing. Keanu Reeves reminded them that integrity still exists in the world, that honesty is still possible even under pressure, and that kindness and truth are stronger than fame or control. And so, the story of that night became more than just an interview. It became a lesson, one that showed how powerful it can be to stay true to yourself, no matter who asks you to be otherwise.